Introduce our second speaker, Chirag Modi. He'll tell us about forward modeling approaches for cosmological analysis. Take it away.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. Hi, I'm Chirag Modi. I'm a research fellow at Center for Computational Astrophysics and Mathematics at Flatiron Institute. And today I'll talk about forward modeling approaches for cosmological analysis. So the three things that I want to communicate through this talk is like, first, what is forward modeling approaches? What do I mean when I say that? Second, why is it necessary in cosmology that we start thinking about these kind of approaches? And third, what are the technical advances we need to make to be able to use these approaches for analyzing the next generation of surveys in this case? Before that, a brief snapshot of my other scientific interests that I'll not have time to talk about. I'm primarily a cosmologist, and I develop methodologies for studying large-scale structures of the universe, both analytic and computational, and the talk will focus on my computational work here. I've recently started dabbling in galaxy formation as well. Over the last 2 years, I've also had chance of working closely with some of the leading machine learning experts and applied statisticians at CCM, where I've focused mostly on developing statistical inference algorithms and machine learning tools in broad data-driven science settings, not only restricted to cosmology. And I enjoy using these things in interdisciplinary settings. So some of the work that I've done in the past is doing causal inference for economics, where we were trying to gauge the impact of policy interventions on how much do your policies affect your outcome, and more recently in estimating fatality rates for COVID-19 in different countries. So if anything on this board interests you, catches your eye, I'll be very happy to chat about that after the talk. All right, on with the talk. So this is going to be a story of a universe. We believe that it was born in a big bang, followed by a rapid phase of inflation, which gave rise to these initial conditions, perturbations at the beginning of the universe. We'll come back to this very quickly halfway through the talk. And these perturbations, essentially, as the universe expanded, these perturbations collapsed under gravity to give rise to the galaxies and galaxy structures that we see today. And as cosmologists, we try to study the distribution of these structures and try to learn about the universe. And we have learned a lot. We have a standard model called lambda CDM, where lambda stands for cosmological constant dark energy model. CDM stands for cold dark matter. But lambda CDM is only one model. And in fact, we have a lot of open questions that we still do not have any answers to. For example, what is dark energy? What is dark matter? How did inflation happen if it happened? What are the masses of neutrinos? Is GR the only theory of gravity? And many more that I have not listed here. And to answer these questions, over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be looking at the universe with a lot of cosmological probes. For example, galaxy clustering, gravitational lensing, 21 centimeter intensity mapping, CMB, and a bunch of others. We have a lot of surveys coming up online for this: DESI, LSST, Euclid, CHIME, HARAX, Salmon's Observatory, CMBS4. Yale is institutional member for some of these surveys, and for others, individual faculty members are playing an important role in this. So the methodologies that I'm going to be presenting in the next roughly quarter of an hour can broadly be applied to most of these probes. But for the sake of concreteness, I'll basically focus on galaxy clustering to motivate the challenges and the examples that I'll take. Okay, so I would like to point out that we are undergoing a paradigm shift in cosmology. And that's generally a controversial term, but I do not make that statement lightly. Because it's not only that we have large number of surveys coming up, each of them will also be collecting large amount of high precision data. So for example, take DESI, the dark energy spectroscopic instrument. Over the next 5 years, it will be looking at 1/3 of the night sky and collect spectra for 35 million galaxies and quasars. If those words don't mean anything to you, then consider this. In the last 7 months that DESI has been taking data, it has already mapped out more galaxies than all the previous 3D spectroscopic surveys combined. And we have been doing this for the last 20 years. So in the last 7 months, we have collected more information than the last 20 years in this case. LSST is going to be a completely different beast. It will collect data on tens of millions of objects over the next 10 years and will allow us to do not only galaxy clustering, but weak lensing, supernova, and many other different kinds of sciences. So it's kind of a given that we'll be making unprecedented constraints on all the cosmological parameters going ahead. What I'm showing here is, for example, is the constraint on Hubble parameter, which is the expansion rate of the universe as a function of redshift, so going back in time. The two red points here are the constraints from BOSS analysis, baryon spectroscopic BOSS survey, which was the largest spectroscopic survey before DESI kicked in. This is what DESI is forecasted to give by the end of it. So much smaller error bars and much higher resolution going back in time. So high precision like this will allow us to answer fundamental questions. For example, neutrino mass hierarchies, constraints on primordial non-Gaussianity for inflation. It will also allow us to study some of the tensions in the lambda CDM model itself. For example, the Hubble tension, where constraints on Hubble parameters from cosmological probes disagree up to like 4 sigma level with some of the late time probes calibrated against Cepheids. And all of this sets stage for discovering new physics, for example, nature of dark energy and dark matter. What I'm showing here is constraints on forecasted constraints from LSST on the dark energy equation of state parameter. This ellipse here in red is the constraints we have from stage 3 surveys, which we have done so far. The ellipse here in black is basically what LSST is forecasted to give at the end of 10 years. The way to read the plot is this, that if this black ellipse is not consistent with this origin point here, then that means that lambda CDM is not the model for our universe. Cosmological constant is not the model for dark energy, and someone might be getting invited to Stockholm. But all of that rests on the assumption that we have the models and analytic capabilities to actually use the information that is available in this high precision data and answer fundamental questions with that. And that is basically the outline of my talk. So in the next half an hour or so, I would like to, in 3 parts, I would like to discuss how I think we should be doing cosmological analysis for the next generation of surveys. In the first part, I'll basically discuss how we currently do this analysis. I'll point out what the limitations are and why we should start thinking about something called forward modeling. And in the next 2 parts, I'll give 2 concrete examples of forward modeling approaches. The first one is called field level inference. The second is called simulations-based inference. For both of them, I'll lay out what their advantages are, what are the advances that we have already made in these directions, and what are the challenges that we still need to meet going ahead. Okay, so let's start with the first part of the talk, with the understanding that with great data comes great responsibility of analyzing it properly. And let's start with how do we do galaxy clustering surveys right now? So in this case, the data is essentially a catalog of galaxy positions. And this is very high dimensional data. So you start by calculating some summary statistic. Mostly we use 2-point functions, 2-point correlation function or power spectrum. And they essentially calculate the average correlation over the universe of density at 2 points as a function of scales. Next, what you need is a theoretical model for this. This is generally so far given by perturbation theory. It looks like fun integrals like this, where the dependence on cosmology parameters enters generally from this P linear term that you see here. The third ingredient you need is an analytic likelihood model, which will allow you to compare your theory predictions with the data that you have observed. And once you have this, you can write down the posterior of your parameters and run Bayesian inference algorithm like MCMC chains to get constraints on the parameters that you are interested in. Most, if not all, the analysis in the last 20 years in cosmology has essentially followed this template. And I would like to point out that moving ahead, each of these steps is going to be a limiting factor in how we do cosmology. So let's look at each of them in a little more detail. The first limitation is that we need to choose a summary statistic, right? And so far, we have been using power spectrum, 2-point correlation function, but that's not going to be sufficient. And the simple reason to see that is this. This field here on left is basically what our universe looks like. This field in the middle is essentially a Gaussianized version of the same field. Both of them have exactly the same power spectrum. And we know statistically that power spectrum is optimal for analyzing this Gaussian field, but it does not extract all the information by any measure from the nonlinear field that we see in our universe. And we know that there are other summary statistics out there which can extract more information from this non-Gaussian field. I'm showing here just one example of doing wavelet analysis on these 3D dark matter density field. The ellipses here in red are basically what power spectrum would get constrained the parameters to be. And the ellipses here in other different colors are different kind of wavelet moments that you can use. That's great, but the question is this. This is actually an inexhaustive list of all the summary statistics that people have proposed to do only galaxy clustering analysis in the last 10 years. Which of these do you want to use? And even if you use all of them, how much information is still left behind on the table? We do not know the answer to these questions. The second limitation is that we need a theoretical model for doing the analysis. And generally, it relies on perturbation theory, which makes the assumption that your observed data is small perturbations away from your Gaussian field. And as a result, it cannot model deeply into the nonlinear regime. All the perturbation theories basically break down on the small scales, as I'm showing in this figure. And it is also hard to include survey systematics like masks, fiber collisions, and other kind of noises which are strictly non-Gaussian in nature. It's also much worse than that, because so far we only have theory models for the endpoint functions like 1-point, 2-point, 3-point functions. And we do not have models for other summary statistics that I flashed in the previous slide. And if you want to use someday neural network-based summary statistics in the future, then you'll probably never have the theory models for these things. So how would you use this for doing any kind of analysis? The third limitation is that we need an analytic likelihood. And because of the necessity, we have generally restricted to using Gaussian likelihood in this case, which I think everyone agrees is not the correct thing to do in all the regimes, even for power spectrum, much less for other summary statistics. Even in the Gaussian likelihood setting, you need to calculate the covariance matrix, which is expensive. And the number of simulations that you need to estimate this covariance matrix scales as number of data points times squared, where n data is the length of your data vector that you have. And that is challenging because just for BOSS survey, which ended in 2015 or something, you require 2,000 full survey realizations to calculate covariance matrix. As you go into the future, your surveys are getting bigger, your data vectors are going to get larger, and you'll need more simulations. And second, if you want to combine different surveys or different observables, then your data vector keeps on getting increasing longer, and the computational cost just gets prohibitive at some point. So I think I've established that there are a lot of limitations in the way we do currently cosmology, in the current way we do cosmological analysis. And so some of us have started thinking of a different approach, which is called forward modeling. And the basic idea here is that instead of using a theory model, you want to use computational simulations as the underlying physical model for your inference. Because of using computations, it by definition takes care of the limitation that you need a theory model for these things. Anything that you can simulate, any regime that you can simulate in your simulations, you should be able to use. And I'll also show how it allows you to do joint analysis. I'll talk about two specific approaches. The first one is called field level inference. It also goes by the name Bayesian hierarchical modeling by some groups. And I'll show how it answers the question of like the choice of summary statistic. And the second one will be simulations-based inference, likelihood for inference, or implicit inference. It goes by different names in different communities and groups. And I'll show how it answers the question of like, how do you do analysis if you do not have the analytic likelihood for your model? But to make things a little more concrete, what exactly do I mean by forward modeling here? What you essentially need is a model or a pipeline which takes in the cosmology parameters and gives you your data back, right? And in traditional analysis, we were doing power spectrum. We're using perturbation theory, which will take in the cosmology and give you the estimate of your power spectrum. So if you want to do forward modeling for galaxy clustering, this is kind of what I propose we need to do. You start with the cosmology parameters and the initial perturbations, which were set up by the inflation at the beginning, the Gaussian perturbations there. You use them to construct the initial distribution of the dark matter in the universe. You forward model that dark matter to collapse under gravity using n-body simulations or particle mesh simulations to get how dark matter is distributed today. And then you populate these simulations with galaxies. So you need to find some dark matter halos, use halo occupation or other semi-analytic models to populate galaxies. And because your data is still high dimensional, you generally calculate some summary statistic with the most basic motivation to average out these initial modes and focus only on cosmology in this case. So what I'm suggesting is that instead of using these integrals, however nasty they might be, at every step of your inference pipeline, you now want to use these simulations instead. And that's going to be computationally expensive. So what makes us think that we can do that? And the answer is this, that in the last 5 to 10 years, we have made advances in computation, statistics, and machine learning, which probably make forward modeling approaches feasible today. Advances like we have GPU accelerated computations. We have supercomputers coming up online, which have thousands of GPUs that we can use to run these simulations. We have developed new Bayesian inference algorithms, which allow us to do high dimensional inference efficiently. And These mostly use gradients, and we have auto differentiation frameworks like JAX, PyTorch, TensorFlow, which have become mainstream at this point. We have developed deep learning algorithms, which not only allow us to accelerate these simulations, but also allow us to do high-dimensional inference and model these things in a much more efficient way. And finally, there's a large-scale resource investment, both from the public agencies and private foundations, in terms of funding, and also in terms of collaboration opportunities. For example, the Yale Data Science Institute that is developed here, where people from domain science like us and statisticians and computer scientists can come together to solve ambitious problems like this. So I would argue that with the confluence of all of these things at this point, now is the right time to start thinking about forward modeling approaches in cosmology. So let's start looking at the first one, field level inference. So in field level inference, the idea is to do exactly what it sounds like. You want to use your simulations to basically model the full field level data. So if your density field looks like this, you want to model the density field directly like this. You do not want to model its power spectrum, two-point correlation function, or wavelet moments. So when I asked the question, which summary statistic you should be using, the answer was none of this. But here's a catch. If you remember the forward modeling pipeline, we started with the cosmology parameters and the initial modes to model the data. And the whole reason why we calculated summary statistic was because the initial modes were high dimensional and we wanted to average those out. So now if you're not calculating the summary statistic of your data, you need to simultaneously infer both the cosmology parameters and the initial conditions of the universe at the same time. How you do it is basically how you do any other Bayesian inference. You write down the posterior of your initial conditions given your data, and then you use inference algorithms to get the answer. For example, in this case, I'm showing when you use optimization to get a maximum posterior estimate of your initial conditions. So this was the true initial conditions that look like. This is what you essentially reconstruct, and this is what your reconstructed data looks like. But let's pause for a second. What I've just proposed is that instead of inferring just a handful of cosmology parameters, which was hard to begin with in the first place, now you also want to estimate density field at all the points in your survey. And so you want to infer like millions of latent parameters at the same time. That's going to be challenging. Why do you want to do that? And in the next 3 slides, I would lay out 3 very good reasons why we should be thinking about field level inference. The first, that it allows you to do optimal analysis. Second, it allows you to do joint analysis. And third, it develops some new science cases which were not possible with the traditional way that we have been doing cosmology. So let's look at each of them one by one. The first, it allows you to do optimal field level inference asymptotically is the optimal approach to do cosmological analysis. And from the statistical perspective, it is easy to see. You're not compressing your data, so there's no information that is getting lost in that compression. If you can model the field level data to full fidelity, that is eventually the best that you can do in this particular case. I'm showing here some of the preliminary results from some of the work that I'm doing right now, where I'm trying to use field level inference to constrain omega matter, which is the matter density, and sigma 8, the amplitude of power spectrum, to from small 3D dark matter density volumes. The constraints from field level inference are in orange, the constraint from power spectrum are in blue, and you can see the gains yourselves here. From a cosmologist perspective, it also makes sense, because what we are trying to do here is undo the nonlinear evolution done by the gravity to recover the Gaussian initial conditions of the universe. And it should sound very similar to what standard reconstruction was doing for baryon acoustic oscillations. This was a technique which was proposed by Eisenstein in 2007, and it has been the driving force behind launching surveys like BOSS and DESI. And what I'm showing here is that the forward modeling approach can do slightly better. What I'm exactly showing here is the Fisher information in the BAO oscillations for different kinds of fields as the function of scale for different number density of the traces that you might observe in the universe. The 2 dashed lines here are the BAO is the information that you have in the field reconstructed by standard methods. And the 2 solid lines here is the information that you have in the field when you use forward modeling to do reconstruction in this case. And you gain about like 20 to 50% more depending on the number density that you're looking at. This is only for real space. In redshift space, the gains are much larger, but I would not go into the details of that. Okay. The second reason why you want to do field level inference is because it allows you to do joint analysis of different cosmological probes and surveys. So if you wanted to analyze two data sets, X1 and X2 simultaneously, the bottleneck with the traditional analysis was that you have two independent theory models for both those data sets. They don't take into the account the fact that the data sets are coming from the same universe. And so you need to model correlations between those data sets. And hence you need to model a covariance matrix and write down a joint likelihood like this. Field level forward modeling kind of switches that around. And instead of capturing the correlations at the level of likelihood, what now you're trying to do is use the same model, the same simulation to model both those data sets. And that captures those correlations into account in the simulation itself. So at the level of likelihood, they become independent of each other. We used that recently to do a joint reconstruction using halo position data and halo velocity data to reconstruct initial conditions. This was work led by Adrian Baer, who is a grad student at Berkeley that I'm helping supervise with this. What I'm showing here is cross-correlation as function of scales between the reconstructed density field and the true initial density field. So the closer the cross-correlation to 1 is, the better it is. The dashed and the dotted lines here are the reconstruction if you use only density or velocity by themselves, and the lines in solid are when you use both of them at the same time. And as you would expect, you gain a lot when you use both the data simultaneously in this case. The third and the final reason I would give to do field level inference is that it allows you to do reconstruction. It reconstructs unobserved fields that can enable new analysis. And this is unique to field level inference. This is something that I'm most excited about in the long run to do with this kind of approach. So I would like to spend some time on this. So let's look at this with an example for 21 centimeter surveys, where we probe neutral hydrogen with surveys like HAREX and PUMA, which hopefully will come up. This is what the true distribution of 21 centimeter of neutral hydrogen looks like in the universe, say. The problem with these surveys is that they have really bright foregrounds. And to remove those foregrounds, you essentially lose to clean those foregrounds, you essentially lose all the large scale modes perpendicular to the line of sight and in a foreground wedge. And this is what your noisy corrupted data looks like. In fact, like depending on what redshift of observations you are looking at, you can lose up to 20 to 80% of your data in this case. And so that severely limits the science that you can do with this in some settings. But what you can do with field level inference is that you still observe the small scales in this noisy data, and you can use that to reconstruct the initial conditions, which can then be forward modeled again to essentially clean your data and reconstruct the modes that you have lost in the wedge. And once you have this clean data, you can do new kind of science. For example, we can cross-correlate that with photometric surveys and CMB lensing. And this is especially crucial at high redshift universe because these are the only traces that we have there. We do not have like spectroscopic galaxies in that setting. So any new science case that you can develop in this setting is great. And I led a series of 3 papers which to lay out the science case for 21 centimeter. But this is only one example, and you can construct other analysis like this. For example, you can use the initial density field to study primordial physics that I'm interested in eventually. You can reconstruct the dark matter density field and study galaxy formation. So basically, you're limited by imagination here once you have access to this kind of machinery. Okay, so I think we have established that field level inference is a good thing to do because it enables optimal analysis of cosmology eventually. Joint analysis of different data sets and some unique opportunities which we not have access to otherwise. The question we should ask then is, what do we need to enable it? And this is where I would like you to take you guys somewhat into the weeds and talk about 2 technical advances that we need to make to do field level inference for cosmological surveys. The first being differentiable simulations, the second high dimensional inference algorithms. And though I would lay both these out in terms of cosmology and like this particular application, these both are getting like a lot of other scientific fields are also looking into similar kind of applications. For example, gravitational waves, high energy theory. So the techniques here are much broader in scope than I would lay out them here. So let's look at the differentiable simulations first. What we need for field level inference is fast differentiable cosmological simulations. And the reason we have laid out is we need to infer initial conditions, which can be a million parameters that you want to infer. And the only way you can do that is if you use some gradient-based inference algorithms, for example, gradient descent optimization, as I was doing in my map estimate, or Hamiltonian Monte Carlo for sampling your posterior. What you exactly need is essentially the response of your likelihood function as with respect to your initial conditions and with respect to your cosmology parameters in this case. So up till 2017, I think to the best of our knowledge, there were only two differentiable codes outside in existence. One was Borg and the other was LSST that Frank was part of. And here they had implemented, I think, gradients of the forward model analytically. But the problem was, I think both of these codes were closed source, so you could not use them in the community. And to overcome that challenge, in 2020, I wrote FlowPM, which is the first particle mesh simulation code written in TensorFlow. It's available online publicly at this link. And because it's written in TensorFlow, it has access to automatic differentiation. You do not need to implement your gradients yourself. It has access to state-of-the-art Bayesian inference algorithms, and it can seamlessly interface with deep learning tools in this case. Just to show how powerful that makes FlowPM, this is the entire 10 line of code, like not 10, 15 lines of code that you have to write at the level of user interface to do reconstruction, which I'm showing in this GIF. This is including writing down your model, writing down your likelihood, calling the inference algorithms, and executing them in this particular case. There was still a challenge in that these differentiable codes are still memory limited. And the reason for that is because you want to calculate your gradient of your initial conditions with respect to your final snapshot, right? So you have to backpropagate through all the time steps of your simulation. And so each of these time steps needs to be saved in the memory so that you can do the backpropagation. To overcome that, we recently wrote another code called PMWD, which exploits the fact that these simulations use leapfrog integration. And so you can just, which is reversible. So you can just run the simulation back in reverse. And that makes the memory cost of these simulations independent of the time stepping. So you can run hundreds of steps of simulation for more accuracy and for observables like weak lensing and stuff in this case. I would also like to point out that even though they are written in JAX and TensorFlow, there's no machine learning involved here. This is pure cosmology up to this point in this case. They are also compatible with GPU, so they are GPU accelerated. FlowPM was already 10 times faster than CPU simulations. PMWD is about 100 times faster. I'm showing here the time taken for one step of the simulation as the function of simulation size. So for 256 cube grid simulations, PMW takes like about 100th of a second. And we believe this might be the fastest PM code out there. In fact, it is certainly faster than some of the deep learning emulators that people train to learn these simulations end-to-end without doing machine learning. Okay, so we have made a lot of advances over the last 5 years in differentiable simulations. For future, there are some obvious extensions that we need to implement. For example, or we would want to implement. For example, we want to go beyond particle mesh simulations. So we need to include baryonic physics, subgrid physics about the missing forces. So far, we can do galaxy clustering with this, but we would want to extend these to weak lensing, Lyman alpha, and other traces that we would want to use. Eventually, we want to do beyond lambda CDM cosmology because that's where all the fundamental questions are. So we want to implement massive neutrinos, primordial non-Gaussianity, dark matter, other dark matter and dark energy models. A lot of foundational work for a lot of these things has been done in these papers, some by me, some by my collaborators, and some by other groups. But yeah, there's a lot of things to be done ahead. Okay, the second thing that I mentioned we need for field level inference is optimal algorithms and efficient algorithms in high dimensions. And the one that people generally use in this setting is called Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. And the idea here is that you essentially follow your gradients to make more informed sampling to generate samples from your posterior. This is good because asymptotically, it can explore the entire posterior. It is bad because, as people who do sampling probably know, consecutive samples are correlated with each other in this case. Because we are in high dimensions, it can get really ugly, and you might end up running 10,000 simulations to generate a single independent point. So what I'm showing here is the autocorrelation length of these samples as a function of scales for the samples that are being shown here. There are 4 points for every vertical, and there are 4 different chains of the sampling that I'm running. And on the large scales, you can have correlation length of 1,000. And it takes about 10 steps to generate one proposal. So that's where this 10,000 number comes from. So I would like to rephrase. What you need is not high dimensional inference algorithm. What you need is accelerated inference algorithms in high dimensions. And we did some work recently around these lines. This is called variational self-boosted sampling. Without going into the meat of this, broadly, the idea was to combine Hamiltonian Monte Carlo with another technique called variational inference. It is essentially a two-step algorithm. In the first step, you do a small HMC chain and you try to learn an approximate distribution for your posterior. In this particular case, we developed symmetry-based normalizing flows to learn this distribution. And in the second step, you start alternatively sampling from HMC and the normalizing flow in this case. The samples generated from normalizing flow are independent of each other, and so they help us reduce the correlation length. That's what I'm showing in the figure at the bottom. The blue line here is, again, correlation length for HMC samples. For variational self-boosted sampling, the correlation length is of order 10 in this case. Thanks. But it does not solve the problems completely, because this algorithm that we developed currently only samples the density field at fixed cosmology, so we are not varying the parameters. Eventually, we want to extend this to parameter inference and jointly sample both the density field and cosmology parameters. Okay, so that was the story of field level inference. The motivation here was to model the field level data directly without any compression. And the price you had to pay was essentially you need to infer cosmology and the initial conditions at the same time. It is worth doing because, as we have shown, it allows you to do optimal analysis, joint analysis of different probes, and develop new science cases with reconstructed fields. Some of the advances we have made in this direction is developing differentiable simulations and accelerated inference schemes. But in the future, I've laid out some future plans. For example, the first thing we would like to do is extend these algorithms for parameter inference and enhance differentiable simulations. The one thing that I have not touched upon is that you still need to learn field level data likelihood in this particular case. I would love to chat about that later, but I don't think we have the time for that right now. But that also sets up for the third part of the talk, which is simulations-based inference, which by definition is set up to overcome this challenge of knowing the data likelihood in the setting. So let's start with the third part, the simulations-based inference things. Okay, so to recap, our goal at the beginning of the talk was to extract nonlinear and non-Gaussian information from cosmological fields. We discussed that there are novel statistics like wavelets and others that we can use to extract more information. But the challenge was that we did not have the analytic likelihood for this. So you cannot write down the posterior, and so you cannot do the sampling. So how do we do inference in this case? And simulation-based inference, as I said, is supposed to overcome this challenge. So let's begin by seeing how. This is going to be a one-slide primer in the SBI simulation-based inference theory. So the key realization of SBI, I'll call it SBI now, just because it's a mouthful. The key realization of SBI is that a simulator essentially defines this data likelihood that we were running after, but it does so implicitly. And by that, what I mean is that you can generate samples from this distribution, but you cannot evaluate the value of this likelihood distribution. To see that more clearly, let's see how we do simulations. The first thing you do is essentially you have some model parameters that you care about, which you sample from your prior distribution. You pass that through a simulator, which you can treat it as a black box, in this case, a white box, where you have some latent parameters which are sampled from their own prior distribution, and out comes an observable or a data realization. If you marginalize over all these latent parameters here, then essentially what this observable is a sample from this conditional distribution, which is exactly the likelihood distribution that you were after. So you have generated a sample from the likelihood that you were interested in, right? How does this help us? How does this help us to do any posterior inference? Well, let's assume that the target posterior that you are after can be written as a conditional distribution Q with some unknown parameters phi. So for example, if your posterior is supposed to be Gaussian, you assume Q to be a normal distribution where its mean and variance are now some unknown function of the data with some unknown parameters phi. And you want to find these parameters phi such that Q matches P. And you can show that mathematically that this is achieved if you fit the parameters phi to maximize this conditional distribution of the model parameters conditioned on the data for all the data that you have generated from this likelihood distribution, which is exactly what the simulator gives you. This is an exact result. Again, there's no approximation here. I've just hidden some math behind, so it might seem like magic, but so far this is just statistics here and no machine learning. So in practice, if you want to do simulations-based inference, all that you need to do is generate some data set from your simulations, assume a parametric distribution, and then maximize its parameter, fit its parameter by maximizing this conditional distribution. And in the limit of large number of samples and sufficient flexibility of your assumed distribution, the assumed distribution will converge to the target posterior. So if you want to do inference, you go out, take data, and just query that through the trained parametric distribution to generate samples from your posterior. The two important points, the two important phrases here are large number of samples. We'll come back to that in a minute. And the second is sufficient flexibility of your parametric distribution, which is why we generally don't use Gaussians, but we try to use something like normalizing flows, which are able to model complex distributions like this. So recently we put this into the practice with Symbic collaboration, where we did the first galaxy clustering analysis using simulations-based inference on survey data. This was done with Symbic collaboration, which is led by Chang-Woo Han, who's also here, and Elena Masara, who's also a part of this. And the data we analyzed here was 10,000 galaxies mapped by BOSS survey. The simulations we used were 2,000 Kyoto simulations. We populated them with a halo occupation distribution to put in galaxies. And then we included survey realism like geometry, mask, fiber collisions. This is essentially what the true data looks like. This is what our simulated data looked like. The statistics we used in this case was power spectrum multiple up to KF.5, just because it's a preliminary first analysis. And I'm showing the results here only for the two cosmology parameters that are best constrained by this, omega m and sigma 8. The results for Symbic are in blue. The results for perturbation theory analysis are in orange. For omega m, we do not gain as much, but for sigma 8, the constraints improve by about 27%. And you can show that the reason why we achieved these gains is because we were using computations to model our power spectrum. So we were able to push to KF.5, while the perturbation theory analysis has to stop at KF.25 in this case. And there's other work being done currently with wavelets, Mach power spectrum, and other statistics that will hopefully allow us to get better gains in this. Okay, so far we have established that simulation-based inference is powerful. It can allow us to use summary statistics without having to worry about the necessary explicit likelihood. Question then is, are there any challenges in applying this to cosmological surveys? And the two that I would like to point out that I'll be focusing on going ahead in my work as well are model misspecification and the number of simulations. So let's look at each of them in training. So the first, and I think this is an open challenge for SBI in general, is model misspecification. SBI inherently assumes that the data that you observe comes from the same simulations that you have used to train your procedure. And when that is not true, your posterior can be overconfident or can just fail catastrophically across the board. What I'm showing here is essentially a preliminary figure from some work that I'm doing right now to test the model misspecification sensitivity of models to SBI in a cosmology setting. What I've done here is I've taken two different ways of populating galaxies in my simulation. They are a 5-parameter HOD model and a 9-parameter HOD model. I have trained my procedure on the 5-parameter HOD model, and I'm trying to predict sigma 8 with that. And if my data comes from the same 5-parameter, which is shown here in blue points, then my inference seems to be doing all right. If my data comes from the 9-parameter HOD model, then in some parameter regime, I'm doing fine, while in the others, I'm doing terrible in this case. So that's a problem now, because we know in cosmology, we cannot model the data at full fidelity. We do not know galaxy formation, baryonic physics, and a bunch of other things. We have open questions in cosmology. So how do we do SBI in the setting where we do not have the exact model? And I'm thinking along these lines for this, is that what we do have is multiple models for the same data observations. So for example, we have these different models of populating galaxies in your simulations going from top to bottom in the increasing order of fidelity or trustworthy physics involved. So we can do two things here. Well, I'd like to point out that at least two things we can do here are, first, we can use data cuts. So there are some regimes in which all of these models agree. So we can just restrict our analysis to those data regimes. This will be a conservative approach in this setting. And the second thing that I would like to pursue is the regimes where these models disagree with each other. We can try to use those disagreement to construct some invariant statistics and try to develop robust algorithms that will such that your inference is insensitive to these differences in this case. There's some work recently in machine learning literature. I'm only citing 2 papers here, but there's a lot of work which can allow us to develop invariant statistics like this to do to construct robust algorithms in this setting. The point being that moving ahead, this is an open problem both in machine learning and cosmology at this point. And in cosmology, at least, we'll require interdisciplinary collaboration between cosmologists, galaxy formation people, statisticians, and machine learning experts to develop algorithms like this. And I've spent the last 2 years trying to develop these kind of collaborations at Flatiron. The second challenge to SBI, which I would say, is that it converges in the limit of having the large number of training data samples. Why is that a problem? Well, if you remember, SYMBIG only analyzed 100,000 galaxies, while BOSS mapped 1 million galaxies. And the reason for that was we were limited by the simulation suite. We used Quixote, which is the largest simulation suite available so far for this. It required 10 million CPU hours to run this, which is a hefty investment. But still, it has only the volume to model 100,000 galaxies. This is a problem because upcoming servers will probe larger volumes and higher resolution in the setting. So how do we generate training data set for simulations like this? Well, I think for this, we'll have to rely on the fast GPU accelerated simulations like PMWD that I'm developing. Of course, particle mesh is not the correct model for our universe. So we'll need to improve the accuracy of these forward models. We'll need to do both, improve the gravity models. So by learning the small scale forces, baryonic physics, there's some work that has been done by my collaborators along these lines already. We would also need to improve the galaxy modeling. So we'll have to go beyond HOD models and use semi-analytic models or something more physically motivated to populate galaxies. The challenge here is that they require merger trees, which you do not get in PM simulations. So I'm doing some work currently to plant merger trees in PM simulations. This is being led by Tree, who is a graduate student at MIT, and who I'm supervising with Rachel Somerville, who is a galaxy formation person at CCA in this regard. In this figure, one of them is a tree generated by our machine learning algorithm. The other one is the tree generated from the n-body simulation. I'll let you guess which one it is. I actually don't remember anymore. So, but yeah, one of them is definitely n-body. But yeah, that's been my talk. We started by discussing how will cosmology look in the next decade. We have a lot of surveys coming up, which will allow us to answer fundamental questions, study current tensions in lambda CDM model, and hopefully discover new physics. But we will be limited only by our ability how well we can analyze these. And I've laid out some of the basic limitations that we have with the traditional way of doing cosmology. And I've proposed forward modeling as a way to overcome those limitations in the settings. The 2 approaches that I've talked about are field level inference, which allows us to model where the objective is to model the data without any compression to do optimal analysis, joint analysis, and develop new science cases. I've laid out some roadmaps that we'll need to solve before doing this for surveys. The second thing I talked about was simulations-based inference, which allows us to use different kind of statistics to do extract information better than power spectrum. And again, I've laid out some of the fundamental challenges that we need to overcome for this. And I think we need to develop these kind of algorithms to learn the nature of universe with the next surveys. Thank you.
Question. Okay, I'm gonna go to Nikhil.
Thanks, Chirag. I have a couple of questions, but I'll ask one and I'll save the rest for when we chat. So let's imagine you could do field level inference, and let's imagine you do this and you get a chi-squared, which does not have 1 per degree of freedom. So, it's not a good fit.
Yeah.
How do I know where to now, you've done this entire thing, you've modeled the observational pipeline, you've all modeled galaxy formation and things like that. How do I now try to figure out where my model is misspecified? Is it misspecified in the physics? Is it misspecified in my galaxy formation model? Is it misspecified in how do I've tracked my observations? How does that all How do I sort of disentangle all of that
Okay,
out?
so I only talked about model misspecification in the setting of simulations-based inference, but it's also true for forward modeling, for field level inference. So I just wanted to clarify, are you asking for which of these? Because my answer will differ based on both of them.
In the field level inference version.
Okay, so in the field level inference, I would say that model misspecification is more of an opportunity than a problem, because you have a lot of you are essentially forward modeling the entire way. So you have a lot of diagnostics that you can do at different stages. For example, in the simplest case, you just calculate the residual. And if the residual has some kind of structure, then that already tells you something about like, oh, you can then make informed guesses about where your model is misspecified. You can also try, again, you don't have to do this. When I say field level, ideally you would want to go all the way to galaxies, but you don't necessarily have to. You can take a step back. You can do it on like larger scales than you would otherwise do, where your model does not need to be that simple. So you have different, the whole point is like of forward modeling is that you have a lot of handles where you can turn on and off things to ask those kind of questions where your model is misspecified. On simulation-based inference, I pose that as a challenge because you do not have those handles. You only get like the posterior of some parameters at the end. You do not get the residuals. You do not have a clear idea of if you change something, how will that change the posterior, because there's the machine learning part involved in between. But for field level inference, I think that is more of a strength that you have these kind of handles to explicitly check your model. Like what happens if I now throw in dark energy and do the whole analysis? Do I get something different out of it? And does it agree better with at the terms of residual? Am I better able to model my full field level data in that setting?
Yeah, if I could just ask a follow on, which is, I guess I'm struggling a little bit with when do I stop adding things and where do, because I have so many places I can add things in. I could add them in to the fundamental physics, and I can add them into the galaxy formation, and I can add them into the observations.
I have a feeling that's a very subjective question, in that like if I go and ask some particle theory or like people working on inflation or dark energy and stuff, they will say that that's wrong and we need to change that and do the analysis. If I go and ask some galaxy formation people, they would like to test their own models. So it gives you basically a handle, a much bigger handle to test your different modeling assumptions in that setting, is the question. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. Field level inference. So I can see sort of two approaches to this. Right? And one is to say, okay, I'm going to start with, I have my initial conditions, and I run my PM code super fast forward. I now have to populate the galaxies in a survey and compare that to the data. And based on the comparison, I now make a modification in my initial conditions, and I keep going, and I solve for cosmology. That is one way to do it. The other way is to say, okay, I'm going to use my galaxy sample that I have, try to somehow from that infer a density field. Okay? And that's what people have done in the past. We have done in the past at least. And that density field, then we run the PM code fast, to get the density field. And then we can play with the galaxies.
Right.
Which do you recommend and why?
When you say like in the second approach, you're starting from the galaxy field, getting the dark matter density.
I have to somehow, right?
Yeah. So
I wouldn't know how to do that accurately.
Exactly. So I think generally I am a fan of forward modeling. So the further you can push forward modeling, the better it is. But you always reduce your data on some level. For example, I'm not suggesting, at least right now, to model all the way to like the telescope data directly. You have already pre-processed that data up to the galaxy setting. So what you're suggesting is to pre-process it one step further and get the dark matter density field as well.
I prefer the first one, but my question basically is it computationally feasible? Because your PM code is super fast, but adding on the galaxies and then getting some summary statistic to compare to the data.
No, in the field level inference, you're not calculating summary statistic in that setting. That's the whole point. You do not want to calculate.
But if you go to galaxies, how do I decide this galaxy distribution compares to this data?
And so in the current like results that we have shown, like even for 21 centimeter, we just used bias model as like a forward model to go from dark matter density field to the galaxy field. We have done some work recently to make HOD models like halo occupation distribution more differentiable, not more like differentiable, to be able to use that and then try to infer the parameters of those models at the same time as you are inferring the initial conditions. So that's the other thing that I did not show, that along the whole pipeline, even after you have PM simulations, you have other parameters, nuisance parameters that you want to infer. And ideally, you want to infer those parameters at the same time that you're inferring your initial conditions, and at the same time you're inferring cosmology. Exactly. If you do HOD, then like HOD parameters. If you have assembly bias, those parameters. So ideally, you want to evaluate the whole thing. And that's what makes the inference. So the parameter inference algorithm that I touched upon that we need to develop needs to take into the account that now your model has become hierarchical. That's why the other name for this is Bayesian hierarchical modeling, because you have parameters at different level. And that's what inferring parameters at different hierarchy makes it more challenging. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask a completely orthogonal question. So independent of the analysis, so that is several, as you and others have said, the next decade or two are going to be enormous surveys available and so on. Some of them are large, some of them are smaller,
Yep.
Some of them are imaging, some of them are spectroscopy. And everybody's motivated by the same handful of cosmological parameters and galaxy evolution questions. So what are you most, what survey seems most valuable to you for getting interesting results?
So currently, just like for like next year or two, I think my focus is like on methodology development, because these techniques are not mature enough yet to apply on survey data. But I think the one that I'll be first implementing these things on will be DESI survey in that setting, because in spectroscopic survey, it's like the cleanest of all the other data sets and probably also the most informative in the setting. In terms of modeling, the modeling thing that we need to develop, that in that sense, it is the cleanest. Least amount of modeling and other modeling fidgety parameters that you want to include in that setting. So just for the first survey applications, that's what I'll be getting towards. But then the approach is essentially agnostic of the observable that you have, as long as you have a forward model. So that's why I prefaced initially by saying that in the long run, I hope I'll be working on applying these to different observables. Some of my collaborators are already working on weak lensing surveys. So like, for example, LSST and stuff. Some of the results that I showed were for Hyrax and Puma, like 21 centimeter things to do supplementary analysis. So yeah, for the first answer would be DESI, I think. Yeah, if you want me to pick one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the only cosmology result you showed was the sigma 8 number. Do you
Yes.
want to comment on that result?
You mean, why did I only show one cosmology result? Or I only showed one. Like, the answer is that because the techniques are not yet mature enough. And the other thing is that for other, like if for any other new technique you would be developing, you can probably do a Fisher forecast to get the answer. The whole point here is to go beyond that. Like, the whole point of simulations-based inference is to not assume a Gaussian likelihood, which basically means your Fisher forecast is like not something that you want to do in this particular setting. In fact, there have been some tension, like inner tension, because some people who did Fisher forecast for wavelet analysis, now when you are doing that in practice, we are seeing that we are nowhere close to those Fisher forecasts in that setting. So that's, and with field level inference, I don't even know how to do any kind of that prediction. So that's the main answer, like why I did not show any cosmological results. Both of these techniques are more motivated from like first principle statistical point of view, rather than some number that I can quote in that setting. Regarding only the 21 centimeter, regarding the sigma 8 result for 27%, I think that was because we were only using power spectrum. And if we use other statistics, I've seen the preliminary results from wavelet analysis, and the constraints there are much better. And you also constrain other parameters than just omega m and sigma 8 in that setting. Yeah.
So I just wanted to actually follow up on Meg's question. So Meg asked, which of the current surveys are you sort of most excited about?
Yeah.
All of these surveys, when we optimize the surveys, we optimize them thinking about power spectrum analyses, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So based on all of the things that you've done with simulation-based inference and field level analysis and things like this, how would you what's the optimal survey that you would build, given the limitations that you will have,
right,
to get the most amount of information out of that survey?
I think something that I would prioritize would be overlap between surveys, because the one strength of all of these approaches is that you can do joint analysis. So you can use the same simulation to get clustering and weak lensing at the same time. That will do a lot of things that will break degeneracies point one, and that will also allow you, make you more robust to the model misspecification kind of things in that setting. So I think that is something that I would begin with the first thing, and then carry on from there. Yeah.
All right, well, let's thank the speaker again. So we'll break for 3 minutes and we'll be back. Okay, we'll give you 5.
Thank you.